Hi guys, welcome back to another Hugh Jeffreys video. In this video, I'm going to be restoring two Google Pixel 3 smartphones. Both are badly smashed on both the front and back, and only one is currently booting up. I received these in a previous phone lot video. The entire lot cost me 138 Australian dollars and consisted of 16 phones, meaning I paid about $8.60 per device. While the exact history of these phones is unknown, I was able to confirm that another phone included in this lot was thrown into an e-waste bin at an Officeworks store, so I believe the eBay seller has dumpster dived all these devices and then sold them on eBay. Our first Google Pixel powers on but has a cracked screen and back panel. The phone also only charges using a wireless charger. The second device fails to charge a battery and will remain on the battery flat screen. Holding the power button, it briefly shows the Google branding before shutting off. Before we get started, I'd like to thank iFixit for sponsoring this video. Get parts, tools, and guides at ifixit.com/HughJeffreys or at the link below. Speaking of parts, I will need some to fix up these pixels. I have two new displays and adhesive from iFixit, as well as new back panels, batteries, and a charging port. Before I go to the trouble of replacing the charging port, I wanted to see if I could get the current one working. My guess was it was full of gunk. Sure enough, using some tweezers, I was able to remove a large amount of dirt buildup inside the port. I could then clean the remainder using a toothbrush and some alcohol. In some cases, this method can fix a faulty charging port. In my case, the port now works, although it can still be intermittent, so I'll replace it anyway. It's now time to go ahead and get inside these phones. I'll heat up the back of each pixel using a heat mat, although a heat gun could also be used. Placing a suction cup on the back, I can pull up on that back glass to be able to get a plastic pick underneath and hopefully be able to separate the back glass from the frame of the phone. In my case, these phones completely shattered into a million pieces whilst trying to do this. With most glass-backed phones, there's a plastic film adhered to the back of the glass. This mostly stops the glass from falling out of the phone when it's cracked. However, on the Pixel 3, the film only covers the middle section, leaving the edges exposed to break away, which could cause the back panel to fall off. After removing the back panel, I'll need to be careful of the fingerprint reader cable, making sure to disconnect it before removing the back panel entirely. With that out of the way, I can clean up the rest of the frame and remove any of the remaining glass which has been left behind. With one phone down, it's time to open up our other Pixel. Repeating the same process, this time around it was so much easier to remove the back panel. As I stated earlier, that plastic film underneath the glass is only covering the center portion, which means the back panel practically broke away with really no heat necessary. I could disconnect that flex cable for the fingerprint reader and get the back panel entirely removed. This time around though, removing the glass shards from the edges was a tedious and painful process. Using a jimmy tool and some picks, I was able to remove the glass shards. To protect my delicate fingers from those glass shards and the heat we applied earlier, I used some regular old gardening gloves. With those back panels we removed, I'll need to take off the fingerprint reader, camera lens, and the LED flash lens before we discard our old pieces of glass. These will need to be transferred onto our new panels shortly. We have definitely created a lot of mess, but we're inside our two phones. The next step is to disassemble our phone so we can replace the front display panel as well as our battery. I'll start by removing the wireless charging coil from both phones and disconnecting each battery. For our device that wasn't powering on, I'll connect one of our new batteries so we can test out our phone to see whether or not it does indeed fully boot up this time. On our first boot, it showed more life than usual, however shut off immediately. After connecting up the charger, we could see it reached a lock screen, although is locked with a passcode. We'll deal with that later, but the phone itself looks to be in a functional state. I'll disconnect our new battery and proceed in disassembling the phone further. The next major component to come out will be our front-facing cameras. I'll need to remove one bracket and disconnect the two selfie cameras. These are glued into position so they require a little bit of prying with a spudger to come loose. Proceeding, I'll disconnect all the flex cables on the upper portion of the motherboard of this phone, as well as remove the very thin and fragile tape from the battery. It's likely that this will become damaged when you remove it, although I don't believe it does anything important. I'll move down to the lower portion of each phone where I can remove the speaker assembly, which is also slightly adhered into place. There is a few grounding clips attached to a few of the screws inside these Google Pixels, so you'll need to keep track of those and make sure to install them in the correct place and orientation on reassembly. With both speakers removed, I'm going to start disconnecting the remaining flex cables attaching to the device's motherboard. There is quite a few of these, and some of them are easy to miss. Always double check prior to removing the motherboard, or you could rip one of these flex cables. There are several screws holding in place the motherboard, as well as some of those grounding clips I mentioned earlier. Carefully putting those aside, I can now lift out of place our motherboard, being careful to deroute any of the cables. There is also a few antenna cables down at the lower portion connecting to our charging port assembly, which we'll need to remove. With the motherboard out of place, I'm going to get the battery out. I'm surprised to see pull tabs similar to those found in the iPhone. However, there is absolutely no clearance to get at these, and there is no way to make more clearance by removing any components, as they're wedged against the side frame, and to no surprise, they tore instantly. So I just pried up the battery itself, which was actually not too difficult. After removing the motherboard on our second Google Pixel, I will try a different method to remove these pull tabs. As they're all joined together, I decided it may be easier to cut them into individual strips. This time around, things started off looking positive. That was until they all snapped clean off. Based on my experience, the best way to remove those tabs is to ensure you have plenty of horizontal room, which obviously isn't possible with this device. So I'm just going to resort to ripping out the battery instead. Before I tackle the display, I'm going to replace this dodgy charging port. Only 2 screws hold it into place, along with a light bit of adhesive. Positioning into place our new charging port, I can screw in the 2 Phillips screws. At this point, we have totally disassembled both phones as far as we need to go. The last thing we'll need to take off is, of course, our busted display panel. For that, we're going to be using, you guessed it, more heat. So resorting back to our heat plate, I'll place both phones on the heat plate for a couple of minutes to soften the adhesive holding on our front display panel. Using a suction cup, I lifted up the display panel enough to insert a jimmy tool in between the display and frame. Then I could use a plastic pick to avoid scratching that frame to separate the display entirely. After removing the display, you can see I've totally destroyed it. Luckily though, we're replacing it. For my second attempt, I wanted to try and keep the screen intact. So starting from the inside, I wedged a pick between the frame and back of the screen. I even used some alcohol to soften the adhesive in an attempt to keep the display intact. However, the display is strongly adhered in the middle section of the frame. As soon as you lift upward on the display, the inner sections of the screen separate and fall into pieces. So we won't be using any of these screens for testing. However, with the screens removed, I'm going to proceed by removing all of the old adhesive from the mid-frame. At this point, we can take a look at all the parts we're going to be discarding from these phones, including the broken display panels, back glass, and batteries. It's time to get all of our new components installed, and I'm going to start by attaching the display panels. The first thing I noticed is these front display assembly adhesive strips from iFixit are actually the rear housing adhesive strips, so somehow those have gotten mislabeled and packaged into the wrong packaging. However, that's not a huge deal, as I can simply cut a gap for the microphone at the lower portion. Next, I will apply some additional adhesive strips in the middle section to ensure the new display is adhered into position just like the original one. With our adhesive ready to go, it's time to crack out our replacement iFixit display panel. Removing the protective film, it looks as though these are refurbished display panels, which means you're going to be getting the original OLED quality from that LG display. After lining everything up, I can simply press it down and adhere it into place. With one down, there's one more to go. The big question is, how are people refurbishing these display panels? They must have some kind of high-tech advanced machine to be able to remove the screens without them completely falling apart, like we saw when I removed the old screens. Proceeding, I'm going to reinstall the motherboard back into the device. I'll start by connecting the various flex cables and antennas back onto our motherboard. However, before we screw everything back into place, I'm going to install our new battery and test out the phone. Thankfully, we see that Google logo and everything appears to be working just fine. I'll shut down the Pixel and continue the reassembly process. After removing the battery again, I will fasten all of the screws holding in place the motherboard, as well as the various antennas and brackets, before reinstalling the two selfie cameras, their bracket, and two screws. At the lower section, I'll reinstall the speaker assembly, the microphone retaining clip, and the several screws holding everything in place. Proceeding, it's time to get that new battery installed. I'll need to remove the old adhesive strips and install some fresh ones. And with that, it's time to get our new battery installed. After connecting it back into place, it's now time to repeat the same process to our second phone. I'll need to reinstall the motherboard, cameras, speaker assembly, and of course, the new battery. And with that, it's time to reinstall the wireless charging module back onto both phones. For the entire repair, I've been using this iFixit ProTech toolkit, and thankfully this Google Pixel only uses standard Phillips head screws, which definitely helps make repair on the phone easier. With the internals of the phone looking spectacular, it's time to turn our attention to the rear panels. I'll need to reinstall the fingerprint sensor, camera lens, and LED flash into position. I used some E8000 glue to achieve this. I'll reconnect the fingerprint cable and the retaining bracket. I can then use some alcohol and a microfiber cloth to clean any fingerprints or dust I've left inside the phones. Lastly, I can remove the plastic protective film from each back panel, line up each back panel and firmly press it into position. With the hardware of the phone good to go, I'll need to wipe and factory reset the passcode locked Google Pixel 3 before we can remove the plastic protective film from both new display panels and both new back glass panels. And we're done. So this is it. Two now fully functional Google Pixel 3 smartphones. One is in mint condition while the other has some marks and chips on the frame. What was once someone's trash has been restored and can now be reused. In fact, I've already found a home for one of these phones. Based on the security patch updates, these two phones haven't been used since December of 2018 and August of 2019. And on that note, this has been a Hugh Jeffreys video. If you like what you saw, hit that subscribe button and consider checking out the restoration playlist for more videos just like this one. And if you're looking for any tips or what tools I use to repair devices, be sure to check out my website, link for which is down in the description. That's all for this video, and I'll catch you guys next time.